All right, you're live.
Good morning. I'm Vice Mayor Shanika Smith and the Chair of the Public Safety Committee. I would like to welcome you to our August 23rd meeting. All council members and staff are participating virtually. To help our audience follow along, I'll state each section of the agenda aloud. We are streaming live on our Virtual Engagement Hub link, which is accessible through our Virtual Engagement Hub link on the front page of the city website. We also have an option for the public to listen by phone by dialing 855-925-2801 and entering the code 9477. For today's meeting, we have the option for people to call in and comment live during the meeting. To call in and comment live, use the same number, 855-925-2801, meeting code 9477. Your phone will be muted and you'll hear the meeting live. At this point, callers will hear. For more options, please press *3. By pressing *3, the callers will continue to listen live and join the speaker queue. Public comment will be heard at the beginning and the end of the public safety meeting. Callers may call only once during the general public comment session, either during the beginning or end of public comment period, not both. Callers will have 3 minutes each. You'll be taking public comment after staff and council introduction. So if you would like to make a comment, please join the speaker queue now by pressing *3. If you're watching the meeting through the live stream, while you're listening to the meeting by phone, please be sure to turn down your volume on your device before you speak. I will now go through and introduce the committee members and staff who are participating virtually. Please make sure your microphone is muted. If you are not speaking, Councilwoman Kilgore.
Good morning.
Councilwoman Kim Roney.
Good morning.
City Manager Deborah Campbell.
Good morning.
Assistant City Manager Rachel Wood.
Good morning.
City Attorney Brad Brenham.
Good morning.
Police Chief David Zack.
Good morning.
Fire Chief Scott Burnett.
Good morning.
Deputy Fire Chief Chris Bazinski.
Good morning.
APD Financial Business Manager Elise Lewis.
Good morning.
Sustainability Director Bridget Heron.
Good morning, everyone.
All right, we'll start the agenda with public comment. Staff, do we have anybody in the speaker queue?
We do. I'll let you know when we get to the last caller.
Okay.
And caller ending in 6029, your line is open.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Conan, and I live in East West Asheville. My comments relate to APD's presentation on asset forfeiture funds. Many national organizations, including the ACLU, have raised concerns over these programs, stating, civil forfeiture allows police to seize and then keep or sell any property they allege is involved in a crime. Owners need not ever be arrested or convicted of a crime for their cash, cars, or even real estate to be taken away permanently by the government. I ask our council members, is this how we reimagine public safety in our city? With limited resources and serious public safety challenges, does it really make sense to double down on a war on drugs mentality? I encourage council members to demand greater oversight and accountability regarding this program. APD should be providing far more details to council and the public regarding the program and the source of these funds, over $400 grand just in the past 3 years. And that's just APD's cut of a larger pool of proceeds. Specifically, what are the demographics of people whose assets are seized? Are they local residents or people stopped in Asheville? Have there been any complaints filed regarding wrongful seizure of assets? There's no reason APD couldn't proactively publish information regarding this program on the city website to answer these questions. I've previously filed public records requests related to this program, but that's not how the city builds trust. This information should be provided openly for anyone to see. Furthermore, if this money is used to offset the considerable cost of drug enforcement, it seems we should have a larger discussion regarding how much Asheville is spending on drug enforcement activities. Does the APD's resource allocation align with council or our community's goals? I would also encourage council members to look at the expenditures proposed by APD. Has APD proposed investments that would address root cause public safety issues? Or are we simply profiting off the war on drugs, literally taking money off of people, then using the funds to pay for an expensive wish list? I encourage council to take a closer look at this program and consider whether the city's participation aligns with our values and public safety goals. I would also strongly encourage council to consider better options to utilize these funds. Thank you.
Caller ending in 2266, your line is open.
Hi, it's Grant Millen. I'll speak at the end of the meeting. Public comment at the end. Thanks.
Okay, just remain on the line. That was our only caller.
Okay, we'll move into approving the minutes. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the minutes from June?
So moved.
Is that second? Okay, I'll do a roll call vote for approval. Councilwoman Kilgore?
Aye.
Councilwoman Roney?
Aye.
And myself, aye. The minutes have been approved. Next, we have a budget amendment to establish a budget for the Asheville Police Department state and federal forfeiture funds already received by the city. Lisa Lewis will present that item.
Thank you. And you can start. Next slide. So a little background about the asset forfeiture program. It is an equitable sharing program which divides the illegal proceeds from criminal activities between the state and federal governments and local law enforcement agencies. The program was developed to help offset the considerable cost of drug enforcement and other applicable joint investigations by allowing local law enforcement agencies to use seized monies for equipment training and improvements that might not necessarily be budgeted for by the agency. The Asheville Police Department has $419,214.47 in shared asset forfeiture funding, which has already been collected but not yet added to the budget for use. The funds are the result of state and federal seizures received since 2019. Staff is requesting the committee recommend to council adoption of a budget amendment in the amount of $419,214.47 in the special revenue fund to establish an expenditure budget for state and federal forfeiture funds already received by the city. This proposed budget amendment would authorize the use of this funding for a new DNA analyzer system, replacing an end-of-life bomb robot, and advancing forensic training for 4 forensic technicians. Next slide. So the state and federal forfeiture fund expenditure budget. The asset forfeiture program is an equitable sharing program which divides the illegal proceeds from criminal activities between state and federal governments and local law enforcement agencies. It's designed to help offset the considerable cost of drug enforcement and other applicable joint investigations by allowing law enforcement agencies to use seized monies for equipment training and improvements that might not necessarily be budgeted for by the agency. Shared funds must be used to increase or supplement the resources of the receiving state or local law enforcement agency. Shared funds shall not be used to replace or supplant the appropriated resources of the recipient. The recipient agency must benefit directly from the sharing, and the shared funds must increase the entire law enforcement budget. Sharing will be withheld from any state or local, next slide. Sharing will be withheld from any state or local law enforcement agency if the governing body or state or local law, regulation, or policy requires or directs 1, the specific expenditures of these shared funds, 2, the transfer of federal equitable sharing funds to non-participating law enforcement agencies, or 3, expenditures for non-law enforcement purposes. Permissible uses of forfeiture funds include law enforcement operations and investigations, law enforcement training and education, law enforcement equipment, and law enforcement travel. Impermissible uses include endowments or scholarships, personal or political use of funds, salaries, bonuses, transfers to or purchases for other law enforcement agencies. Next slide. So the police department has $419,214.47 in shared asset forfeiture funding, which has already been collected but has not been added to our budget for use. The proposed budget amendment would authorize the use of this funding for a new DNA analyzer system, replacing an end-of-life bomb robot, and enhancing forensic training for 4 forensic technicians. None of these items were budgeted by the police department for the fiscal year 23 operating budget. These are costly items that will help ensure the safety of the community without having a direct impact on taxpayer money. The funds are the result of state and federal seizures received since 2019. And in order to spend the funds that have been received, a budget amendment is required in the city's special revenue fund. Next slide. So to highlight a few of the items we are talking about purchasing here, we have a DNA analyzer system. It is a rapid DNA platform. Forensic DNA profiles can be completed within 90 minutes. Law enforcement personnel can identify or clear suspects faster. Property crime processing takes currently about 6 to 8 months through the state lab, so this would cut that exponentially. And the system costs about $226,000. Next slide. The Caliber Flex bomb robot is required equipment to maintain our bomb squad. The current robot is more than 20 years old. It offers a lift capacity of 80 pounds, remote capability of more than 300 yards line of sight. The command and control unit provides automatic preset positioning to facilitate rapid deployment. The unit provides a 3D avatar that offers real-time positional feedback on the actual position of the robot. It comes equipped with simultaneous, flexible, and precision controls, lasers with integrated LiDAR distance sensors, 2-speed PTZ, that's point, tilt, zoom camera, and arm control. All operators will receive certified training from the FBI. Service area includes all of Western North Carolina. The robot is used or placed on operational standby between 20 to 40 times a year for incidents such as known improvised explosives and devices, decayed commercial explosives, or discovered military ordnance, suspicious packages, dignitary protection details, viable bomb threats. We assist the emergency response or crisis negotiation teams, hazardous materials disposal, and the robot costs about $236,000. Next slide. We also would like to send 4 officers to advanced forensic training using these funds. The National Forensic Academy is an intensive 10-week training program designed to meet the needs of law enforcement agencies in evidence identification, collection, and preservation. The NFA is recognized by the IAI as providing the necessary training required for crime scene certification. There are 400 hours of training per session, 170 hours of in-class work, and 230 hours of field practicum. And the cost is approximately $60,000 for those 4 officers. Next slide. So our key takeaways here. The asset forfeiture program is an equitable sharing program which divides the illegal proceeds from criminal activities between state and federal governments and local law enforcement agencies. It's designed to help offset the considerable cost of drug enforcement and other applicable joint investigations by allowing law enforcement agencies to use seized monies for equipment training and improvements that might not necessarily be budgeted for by the agency. The Asheville Police Department has $419,214.47 in shared asset forfeiture funding, which has been collected but not added to the budget for use. The funds are the result of state and federal seizures received since 2019. Staff is requesting the committee recommend to council the adoption of a budget amendment in the amount of $419,214.47 in the special revenue fund to establish an expenditure budget for these state and federal forfeiture funds that we've already been received by the city. And this proposed budget amendment would authorize the use of this funding for our new DNA analyzer system, replacing an end-of-life bomb robot, and advanced forensic training for 4 of our forensic technicians. And last slide. The requested action is staff is requesting the committee recommend to council the adoption of a budget amendment in the amount of $419,214.47 in the special revenue fund to establish an expenditure budget for state and federal forfeiture funds already received by the city.
Thank you. I have a question. If these are funds that were gathered over time from 2019 to the current date, It's possible that this fund could make up amount from seized money and property from alleged illegal activity that has not yet reached conviction or admission of guilt. Can you speak to that?
I mean, there are certainly cases that have not been fully adjudicated, but the vast majority are. You also have to remember that a lot of these cases are still working through their way through the courts, and that this money has been seized through and by the federal government and has been allocated. So we just accept the money as it comes in. Just speaking to individual cases, I can't do that.
So it's highly likely that we'll be accepting and allocating funds from possible individuals who aren't guilty and could come back to reclaim money and property?
Not the funds that we've received, no.
Questions from the committee?
So expanding on that, Vice Mayor, I think that I don't yet have enough information on where these funds come from as a breakdown. I appreciate what we heard earlier in public comment. I share those same questions. Are these funds being seized from locals? What are the demographics? We know we've had disparities in the criminal legal system. So a breakdown of where these funds are coming from is, for me, more acceptable than saying we just accept the funds. I think we have to own that we are accepting funds and extracting resources from the community that can't bear the burden of suing the federal government to reattain their funds or their assets. My comments today are based in a concern about the principle of asset seizure and whether or not we should be participating. I've received a number of public comments regarding asset forfeiture, and the ACLU has taken issue with seizure in general. So I think it's possible that we actually need more information before a budget allocation is made. Three of the concerns I have are we have serious issues with violent crime in our community, especially among our youth, because we've already seized these funds and they are available. Could these funds be allocated to youth mentorship programming, violence interrupter programming, or capital expenses? Number two, where else can they be distributed? So I see that part of the funds are being suggested for distribution to training. Could that training also include youth mentorship, violence interrupter programming, homelessness outreach, other root causes of crime? And then the third one is, if we don't participate in the program, which other entity receives the funds?
Brad.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Roney, or Councilwoman Roney, excuse me. I may be able to answer some of those questions for you. I did my best to try to remember everything you said, but please let me know if I forgot something. The Equitable Seizure Program, as has already been stated, is run through the federal government. It is regulated specifically by the Department of Justice, who provides a very clear matrix of what these funds are permissible to be spent on and what they are not permissible to be spent on. So let me answer your last question first. The federal government retains full authority whether to share any of these funds or not. But if they are going to share them and any individual recipient, such as a local government, decides not to participate in this, they are likely to just give those funds to another either state or local law enforcement agency. So in other words, we would either get this portion or they would go to some other law enforcement agency within the state or nationally. With regard to what the money can be spent on, there are very specific DOJ regulations telling you what you're allowed to spend the money on. And the very high level requirement is that they must be law enforcement purposes or related to law enforcement. And even within law enforcement, there are some limitations on that. As was mentioned during the presentation, you can't spend these on law enforcement salaries. The expenditures proposed are within the allowable use. I will say that there is a very small allowance to be able to utilize the funds for the support of community-based organizations. But there's quite a few strings on that. The primary one is that organization's purpose and the use of the funds must be specifically related to and consistent with the local law enforcement's mission, policy, or initiative. So they must be very closely related to APD and APD's initiatives itself. However, perhaps one of the two biggest limitations on that particular expenditure category are these. Number one, the expenditure cannot be any more than $25,000 annually, which means it would be a fraction of the total funds we've received this time. And if any more funds are received, you would potentially be capped out. Secondarily, it places the requirement on the agency, in this case APD, to go through the federal auditing process to determine the sufficiency of the recipient. And every expenditure of funds must go through the federal auditing principles, which APD would be in charge of. I would leave it to APD and the chief to tell us whether or not they would have the resources to accomplish that. But those are two very important limitations we have to be aware of if we're going to consider the very limited category of funding any outside community-based organizations. And I would mention there is also I don't want to say a clawback procedure, but there is an ability to cancel the equity sharing program if at any point the governing board, which would be the city council in this case, directs APD to use the funds on any specific expenditure. So I want to caution the board, both in this particular group as well as city council, from asking that any or passing any law or policy which would direct APD to spend the money on any specific item, because for whatever reason, the DOJ has specifically called that out as a reason that they would cancel the sharing program for that particular agency. So I'm happy to answer any other questions. I hope I've hit most of what you've asked, Councilmember Roney, but please let me know if there's additional information.
Can you clarify that we are not, it sounds like you're saying we shouldn't ask for any specific expenditure because that could result in a clawback.
It's really interesting, and let me read the specific provision to you. These are directly from DOJ's regulations on the equitable sharing program. The sharing can be withheld, and this again is DOJ's purview entirely, if one of three things happens, and those three things are the following. If the local governing body has a regulation, local law, policy, or if you just simply direct specific expenditure of the shared funds. And that's the number one, it's an entirety. So if the governing board is saying, we want you to spend money on X, as opposed to those decisions being made primarily from the agency who's the recipient, that would be a problem. The other two are a little more specific. If you are directing that the funds be transferred to a non-participating law enforcement agency, so any other law enforcement agency that's not participating in the program, or finally, if you are directing the expenditure for non-law enforcement purposes. So that mirrors again that these funds are very specifically limited to law enforcement uses. And although there is a small carve out for the ability for closely associated organizations that are 501c3s or C4s, nonprofits in the community, to be able to receive a portion of those funds up to $25,000, those are only permissible if APD follows all of the federally imposed auditing requirements along with it.
Thank you for that, Brad.
Sure.
So I anticipate there are going to be more questions around our policies. The tenure of Ron Moore is not forgotten, nor the city's role in the theft of items from the seizure room that came to light in 2014. I recognize that not all the people involved in this conversation were around in 2014, but it is not forgotten and it's easily searchable. Additionally, I'm concerned about the cost of asset seizure. So at this moment when we have very few resources, including staff resources, and our goals to reimagine safety and to build trust and to ensure and bolster the integrity and the trust of Asheville Police Department in the community, I wonder if participating in this program that requires the burden of the challenging of the seizure to be on the residents actually gets in the way of our goals. that instead it moves towards policing for profit and profiting from the war on drugs. So what is the cost of accepting these funds to our community is important. We do have limited resources and we have big council priorities. So it's not only for me just where it's going, but where it came from, how it's used, and how it's helping us reach our goals. So with all that in mind, I have already reached out to the city manager, and my request right now is that we've received this presentation today, that we will hear and have heard public comment. We have questions as a commission or as a subcommittee. Could we then see this decision come back to public safety in a month once we've got some more answers to our questions, and then before it goes for a recommendation to the full council?
So is there a time limit here? Is this time sensitive? Do you have time to hear it again and have our questions answered, and possibly, maybe the direction of funds be reimagined and a different items presented, or a list of items presented?
So I wonder, number one, what questions haven't we answered first? And then I hope that the chief will chime in here in a minute. And then secondly, in terms of redirection and kind of looking at the purpose for which we are recommending that the funds be spent, I think are directly linked with our goals of, first and foremost, solving crimes. We are requesting that the funding be particularly used for a DNA analyzer, which helps us solve crimes, in particular rape crimes and violent crimes, in a much more timely manner than what we have been able to do it in the past when it goes through that state process. The robot will be a regional asset. And then getting our employees trained is always a high priority for us, again, so that we are able to solve crimes quicker, faster, and fairly. I would ask the chief if he can chime in.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Again, I'm a little confused as to what we haven't answered. I mean, I can certainly not account for, which every single dollar that came in and the investigation surrounding it. That would be extremely difficult to do. But yes, I mean, if I certainly believe public safety is a council goal. And certainly, and especially considering the staffing crisis that we're currently experiencing, all of this equipment and all of this training are force multipliers for us. Specifically, DNA analysis, which accompanies almost every crime, whether it's property, violent crime. The ability to obtain DNA profiles sooner brings investigations to a quicker conclusion, which requires hundreds of savings in staff hours. So certainly that's a very important piece of equipment. And again, as the city manager just articulated, this robot is replacing a 20-year-old piece of equipment. Technology has advanced significantly over that period of time. And it wasn't very long ago that we had an explosion down at the Vance Monument where our bomb team was called out. And again, this is a regional asset. We are called by agencies all over the county and all through Western North Carolina to assist with ordnance disposal. So there's a huge benefit, not only to our community, but all of Western North Carolina in obtaining that robot. And of course, the forensic training goes without saying. This is one of the finest forensic institutes in the nation that we're looking to send our people to be trained in proper evidence collection, which affects every single crime out there. So to have a highly trained and highly functioning unit is extremely important, especially when we're looking at a 33% rise in violent crime in this city. So that's what we're using this funding for. As Mr. Branham articulated, the uses of this money are very strictly, there are very strict guidelines in place that specify what it can be used for. As he said, there is a small amount for community programs, which we would always consider, but the guidelines are very strict and the auditing procedures are very, very strict. A lot of hours and a lot of resources would be needed to put all that into place. So I think we're definitely in line with the goals of this community where it pertains to public safety.
Sandra?
Okay. Yes, I hear both sides. I hear, and I you know, I appreciate some of the points that Shanika and Kim have brought up, which are very good points and things that we may, you know, need to look into, you know, as a public safety committee down the line or whatever. As far as the expenditures being spent on the things that the police APD has actually have here suggested, those to me are so important at this particular time, especially in light of people of color basically are sometimes held basically on charges because we're not able to quickly identify, you know, that they're not the culprit or whatever. So as far as the DNA testing machine, that to me, I think is extremely, extremely important. And also the forensic training, because like I said, a lot of times we're the ones, people of color are the ones that actually pay the burden of being held longer and put through a lot more, you know, of the stress and the indignities that basically and jailed for things that basically they don't have the money to be able to get out or bail out. So now we have a way to actually maybe get to conclusions quicker for our people. So that to me, I think is extremely important. And as far as the trying to find out as far as what the funds can be used for later and things of that nature, that's something I think that we could maybe consider in another conversation. But I don't have a problem with where that money's been spent right now because I think it's very much needed in our community.
So can anybody speak to how sensitive it is with time? Like, when do we have to make the decision?
I would, Vice Mayor, I would just reiterate, APD is down 50% or more of detectives. Our major cases are suffering.
I get that, but this is my thought concerning the entire fund. It came to my mind maybe earlier this year how forfeiture could be used in the communities that are extremely overtaken by a lot of violent and drug activity. Now, I can make my own assumptions about the sum total of $419,000 that, even though it's an equitable share between state and federal government, I would say that the larger amount of the total probably came from drug seizure. And we know what drug activity and all the other associated crimes that come along with drug activity, manufacturing, and distribution it has on Black communities, our community in general. So when I think about where the money is coming from, if there were if the money was seized and then conviction, there was a guilty conviction. I also think about, hey, if the activities that generated this illegal money came from activities within communities who bear the brunt of whatever happens in that community, that type of performance in their communities, should it not some way have a more direct impact on, you know, the individuals that witness and have to live through. So I look at DNA analyzer system. I see how that can be relevant. Bomb bot, I see how that can be relevant in forensic training. But I think about the wish list of the community, and that is to have more programs around violence interruption, programs to kind of help move forward the conversations about how to stop gun violence. That does not mean it has to go directly to an organization. We don't have to go through an audit. We don't have to do that. But, I'm just thinking about ways in a broader sense that these high crime areas can benefit and get see the direct fruit of this amount of money. And what we have, our list we have so far, I can see a benefit, but I don't know if it has a direct and immediate impact as another list of opportunity items. Y'all can go on and speak. You don't have to raise your hand.
Vice Mayor, I just wanted to thank you for those comments because I've also had some concern about the fact that we're talking about equitable distribution, but it's really just for the public benefit of anyone who's watching and how this is documented. We're talking about the split between the federal, state, and local entities. We're not talking about the disparities of the burden of the war on drugs and of violence in community and where resources are just extracted from. So we have a long way to go in addressing those disparities. But when we're talking about equity, that is not the kind of equity we're talking about with this fund, but it could be. And so that's why my suggestion is, while I support training for sure, and I think that we could probably look at where that kind of training could be expanded to meet our goals around violence interrupter programming. We just heard from JARC, we just heard from youth mentorship groups. Like, what could we do around reading those urgent needs? I support what the Vice Mayor pointed out.
It's kind of hard to have a conversation after what Brad read to us, that we can't put items on the list. We can't make suggestions. So we have to speak very broadly about what we would move forward to larger council for a final decision. But just thinking about the gun activity over the summertime, like what can help us land some type of arrest. And I know there are a couple things that can be suggested, Lord forbid, but I'm looking for that. What is burdening us right now to the point that people are afraid or is causing cycles of grief? And some of the things that we have listed, I will agree, that forensic training is much needed. But some of the other items, I'm not sure that is fitting, again, our immediate need. So is there a motion?
Well, okay, I just want to ask one question. And I realize that, like you said, APD is down 50%. And I don't know exactly as far as your budget. I'm just asking this question. It looks like we still have a lot of money in APD that's basically not being utilized because we're not paying salaries for a lot of the forces down. So I'm just trying to figure out some of the programs that basically Kim and Shanika, the violence interruption and, community training and all these programs are definitely needed. Is there any way to find in the budget now that they can actually allocate funds to certain programs to help with that? Because basically, if those programs are implemented and they help cut down the need for a lot of the officers that we actually are not really paying or whatever now, is there any way that certain amount of money can be allocated toward these programs in the community to help with that, to reduce that, especially because we have a reduced police force? It seemed like that would actually sort of offset each other if they actually could work. So I just want to ask, is that possible?
Well, for me, I would say that when I look at the ACLU and I look at the history of our own department and our own actions, and when I see where resources are extracted from, and the community, we have made goals around ensuring equity in what we do as an organization. So addressing those disparities, especially when we know the limitation of what we do about resource extraction. Now, we don't have details, but that's still a lingering question, is like, where did the most resources get extracted from in our community? Is it the high intensity drug traffic areas? Because I think a correlation could be made.
So I'd like to respond to the question, Ms. Kilgore, with regards to APD salary savings. Unfortunately, a lot of those savings actually are being redirected back into the organization to, when I say organization, I mean into APD, to actually do retention and recruitment. Our goal is not to stay down the numbers of police officers that we have in this community. Every time there is a crime, the community feels like that APD has failed them, has not provided the type of protection or prevention and arrests that are needed to get in particular, our violent crime numbers down. So a lot of those savings are going right. They're not necessarily savings, because again, we're having to pay police officers with regards to retention because they are so overworked. They're working way more hours than is healthy right now for us to present some level of safety. They're being reassigned and doing a number of things that, you know, we're trying to do creatively by sharing a lot of the responsibility that used to be for APD. We're asking other departments to pick up some of those responsibilities. Just our issue related to the unhoused alone, I cannot tell you the amount of resources that are being taken to address some of those issues. I know that you all have some issues philosophically, I believe, with the asset forfeiture program. And maybe that is something through the budget process or some other avenue that we can have those types of discussions. I would hope that you all would not return these resources, particularly the resources needed for that DNA analyzer and for the forensic training. Those things are desperately needed to solve crime quicker, faster, and more equitably to ensure we get the right person. I'll stop there.
Kim.
In the last budget cycle, we saw that there were additional capital improvement project funds that were available, and a mobile crisis response unit was purchased that did not require council approval. And it was a large allocation because we had so many additional funds. So I guess my question is, in anticipation of we might see that same thing happen again, is it possible that because these items are so badly needed that we could purchase them with our existing capital improvement funds?
If we are talking about, and I think I'm hearing your question right, Ms. Ronnie, in terms of capital improvements, we are getting ready to, and this will be presented as part of the manager's report later on this evening, a facility study. We are woefully short of resources to address capital improvement needs in our community and for our facilities.
Yeah, not to confuse with the assessment. Maybe what I mean to say is that there was a significant amount of funds available that were used to purchase the mobile crisis response unit. That tells me that we can anticipate that there will be available funds in this cycle as well. And if we so sorely need the DNA equipment, then we should purchase it, but we would need to purchase it regardless of these funds. Is that correct?
Yes, it would be a matter of, based on our priorities and our limited resources, what would be in the list of needs, particularly with capital needs, what would be the priority? I'd ask Scott if he could respond to maybe just clarify how we were able to purchase that mobile command unit, and that it was a combination of a number of departments that agreed to contribute funding.
We surely could have that conversation again, as we did in the last cycle. And yet I wonder if we brought this conversation about asset forfeiture back at next month's Public Safety Committee, if we could see what are those priorities that we are choosing between. Like, how can we make sure that the Asheville Police Department has the equipment they need for this DNA assessment device, to make sure that it's there, but what else are we not purchasing or not prioritizing because we're purchasing that?
Or just if I can weigh in, are you asking what APD is prioritizing?
If this could be a question that could come back, if because we need to purchase this piece of equipment, if we did not purchase it with the asset seizure funds, where would it come from? Because I'm hearing that it needs to be purchased. And then because we would have to purchase it from another source of funds if we didn't use this one, what else would we be deprioritizing in our budget?
I mean, I can't speak to the overall budget.
You can for APD, just speak to APD's budget or priorities.
I mean, APD's budget priorities is maintaining staff, and to maintain staff and to recruit new staff, we had to adjust our salary and benefits to compete in the marketplace. Our number one priority is to get bodies to assist us. We've lost, and it's well documented, we've lost more than 100 officers in 600 years of experience. So our priorities are to get replacements and to get them trained to the level that they need to be to produce at a high level. Our secondary goals are to make sure they're equipped properly. And that's what we're trying to do with this request, is to equip our officers with the best crime fighting tools that are out there, and also to provide regional assets such as the bomb robot to address those concerns. So these are our top priorities. Our priorities are to have enough people to keep our city safe, but also to make sure that they are the best equipped and best trained officers in the entire state. Those are our priorities in a nutshell.
Thank you for that. I'm just wondering, because we have so few resources as far as our staffing, if this is the right time for us to be staffing the program for the bond robot for the region. So for example, is there another way that we could look at this as our priorities? Is regional our priority right now? I don't see that we have the staff capacity for that and the deep need in our community, which has already been stated today.
This robot is a federal requirement to maintain a bomb unit. And I can have Captain Silberman explain just how often that unit is called into the field.
So it fluctuates. Obviously, we get called more often during election years, especially when dignitaries pass through town. There are a number of events that'll go on at like Harris Cherokee Center that'll elect to have a bomb sweep. The robot will be put on standby. in the way of what we call incidents, not activities, where we have viable explosives on site or what we believe are viable explosives. That could range between 15 and 26 times 25. I think 26 was a ceiling we saw 2 years ago, times a year. And it doesn't always involve what you would think of as a bomb. Where in Western North Carolina, I'd say in the past 10 years, I think I've covered about dispose of about 2,000 pounds of commercial explosive. Some of that is decayed severely. We use a robot for a lot of activities that might be too dangerous, especially when we're exploring old barns and things like that and having to unwrap sticks of dynamite. Having a very nimble robot is very important. The chief did mention it's a required piece of equipment. We get audited every 5 years. Last year was our last audit. The F6 from Remotech, we've had before I started work at the Asheville Police Department, and it has been a good robot. We have upfitted it at least twice that I know of. It is getting past the point where it will work viably, and the big thing is it is very difficult to be specific, and I used the word nimble before, but you really want to be able to control the amount of force you're using with the claw. You really want to be very aware of the distance your robot is to things in its environment, and the F6 is just not going to provide that any longer. It's having some mobility issues. Just getting it downrange is sometimes very, very difficult. It was mentioned that where else could we put this resource? Every employee on the bomb squad is an extra duty for us. It's something we do in addition to a normal duty, and we're happy to serve Western North Carolina and the agencies surrounding us.
Thank you so much for some more details. It is a case has been clearly made for why we need updated equipment in the Asheville Police Department and for our staff, which I think makes a really excellent case for why we need more detailed understanding of the needs of the department and details around our budget in general. My mind is not changed on why we are using these funds specifically for these items. When we're talking specifically about where the funds come from and the community that has the deepest need, those are still questions that remain unanswered. And why I would ask that we have a better understanding of where these funds come from before we suggest the use.
And I think I would like just an explanation. It seems like it's very hard to come back to this committee with a pinned down response of where these funds came from. Just hearing the conversation and the chief's response, I don't think they're going to be able to come back with a laundry list, but I think where my mind is going right now is from the point stated numerous times before. I can just imagine what communities were harmed by the activities that made up the sum total of this amount and just the overall amount that is shared between state and federal government. And when I look at what the items that you have on your list, 2 of them are in response to those crimes, but not getting out in front of the crimes. Looking at one of our number one priorities right now, at least, a lot of community members feel that the number one priority should be coming up with some type of defense or deterrence against all the gun violence that we're seeing every week. And listening to the cry of community saying, hey, we want to organize to get out in front of a lot of what's going on and a lot of what our community has continued to grieve over and lose life over. How can APD aid the community in organizing some type of front so that we don't have to worry about walking the streets or going out enjoying nightlife? So as I stated before, there are some things that I can present, force multipliers that I can present, but I think that is forbidden in this in this specific case, I don't want to forego the opportunity to utilize the funds. I do think that there is a way that we can add more justification to where the money came from. I do believe that we can get a better picture about what is the priority of the community and how can the use of the funds be used to directly impact people who are victims of crime or continuously dealing with a lot of gun activity. I don't think that would be hard for us to do. And that does not mean that we wash the entire list, but I believe that maybe there is a way that when looking at the list and making a decision at a later date, the community can say, hey, if these funds were generated in my community, then I feel that how the money was spent is a give back. And right now, I don't know that I can fully say that, even though what has been presented, the 3 items that has been presented, may feel like it is very beneficial to the organization. So I don't think that we have the agreement to move forward. Maybe we revisit this at the next public safety meeting.
Again, I mean, what I can say is these funds were acquired not through small level drug trafficking. These were major investigations where there were major seizures of cash, drugs, and guns. That's the source of this revenue. And to try to go back, and that's what I think you're asking me to do, is to account for every dollar where it came from over the last.
No, I heard you. I don't think you can account for every dollar. The way this works, I don't think that you would be able to go and say, case by case, this says how much money was seized. And, I don't think that is possible. I'm talking to the latter point. If we are going to use the funds, then I would like to see a different vision for how the money is spent. That's the best way I can put it without being direct about, item by item wish list.
And I understand. And again, the guidelines are very specific that the agency must benefit. It's for sworn law enforcement training and law enforcement equipment. There is a small allotment that could be considered for community-based programs, which I would certainly consider. But
yeah, and I don't know if $25,000 will actually make an impact on an organization when dealing with the type of issues that we're dealing with. But I do believe that there is a way that the community can benefit without it $25,000 going to an organization. I'm thinking I can tell you just a small piece of my mind. Last weekend, or maybe a culmination of the last month or so, the last few weeks, we've had a lot of gun violence. And I think in a couple instances, people were able to use their phones to get a snapshot of vehicles, but I don't think it was a very clear picture. But if we had something to give us a clearer picture of assailants leaving the scene of a crime, or cars leaving the scene of a crime, then maybe we have a better chance of pinning down who's creating a lot of mayhem. That's just a broad, everybody else can try to figure it out. But when I think about what the immediate threat is, and how can we take this opportunity to create a defense against the immediate threat, that's what I think about. Analyzing DNA after an event has happened and doing forensics after an event has happened. I want to see something more on the front end. How do we get out in front of things, deter it, and mitigate?
And I think, Vice Mayor, we totally agree with you in terms of prevention. We definitely think that too often APD is asked to react to. But the fundamental principle of reimagining public safety is that it is not APD's role alone to address the issue of community safety, and that it is going to take a village of community resources and assets. And I think what APD is trying to present is, here's our lane. Here's where we have an opportunity with federal resources, federal and state resources, to do our best in the lane that we are in, which is unfortunately having to react, but needing the community to help us be a lot more proactive. We are somewhat challenged, particularly with these type resources, as to how the funding can be used. And what staff presented was our best estimate of where our needs are, how we can address the issues that are before us. And I, again, totally agree. A lot of this is reaction. But we totally need the community to help us on a lot of the proactive things that, unfortunately, these particular resources may not avail themselves to be used in that manner. So with that, I think we hear you all. I don't know if you all are going to take a vote or if you're just directing staff to come back to the next Public Safety Committee meeting with additional information.
Sandra, I haven't heard from you.
The only thing okay, like I said, basically the whole thing that sort of dictates where we go with this are the requirements and restrictions that's placed on the money from the DOJ. That basically sort of controls sort of the whole narrative as what can be done with those monies. So in taking in consideration that, like I said, the DNA analyzer and the forensic, those things to me are a no-brainer. As far as the equipment that the BUM equipment, in light of where we are going today with this particular society and all the different threats that we're constantly having, I could see the need for that type of equipment. And not only do they handle just the bombs, it's basically like he said, they deal with a lot of substances that are basically very volatile substances and things of that nature. So it actually does a few more things. And in light of our equipment being so old, and where would we be able to, like what Kim spoke of earlier, find the money in the budget to be utilized for that? I would think that we need to probably look into the budget for other ways that we have more flexibility to use the money toward the community investment as far as, anti-crime and violence interruption. So I think as far as this money, that's the way I look at it. As this money to me is being well spent, and we need to look into other areas that we can find money to address those needs that are so sorely needed in our community because of the restrictions. If not for those restrictions, I'm just saying to take a chance and try to get around restrictions that could cause damage to the community as our money being clawbacked or, whatever the situation, to me, it's not worth it, rather than to look into the budget for other ways that we can fund the programs that you and Kim speak of that are so much needed in the community.
Is there a motion?
And just a reminder that and Vice Mayor, I apologize for interjecting, but you said we'll have to
is there a motion? I'm asking the committee, is there a motion?
Well, the thing is, it looks like I'm the only one sort of leaning towards this. So, of course, I can make a motion that we approve to allow the APD to use the money for the requested expenses. But as far as I'm concerned, that's where I stand.
And just for clarification, this is on council's agenda for tonight. So I'm assuming someone would also vote to pull it to have discussion.
And I'll submit a second. Not that I don't have deep reservation. And my reservation has already been stated so many times before. But it's just a I just would like something different to come out of forfeiture than what is presented, even though I do see the need and the validity. I'll do a roll call vote for approval.
Before we do a roll call vote, because we have a motion and a second, may I make a comment?
Yeah.
My vote on this is not because I don't think we need training. We do need training. In fact, I think we probably should be using more of this fund for training to get to our goals and to address deep need in our community. But I don't think we have enough information on the demographics impacted by asset seizure in general. I think we needed more answers to our questions today to ensure the funds are equitably distributed in achieving our goals around reimagining public safety, which is why I will not support this moment today.
I'll do a roll call vote for approval. Sandra?
Aye.
Kim?
No.
Myself, aye. The motion carries. We're going to move to the next agenda item. Okay, I'm on a different computer, so bear with me.
There you go.
Oh, Elise, you're back again for bike safe and high intensity drug trafficking areas, the grants.
Okay. And you can start. Go ahead to the next slide. So we have two grants that these are renewals of grants. These are not new grants. We are already doing these grants in our agency. One is the Bike Safe NC program. It's a partnership with the Governor's Highway Safety Program and the North Carolina State Highway Patrol. It is aimed at reducing motorcycle fatalities. These grant funds are used to promote awareness, and the Asheville Police Department acts as the fiduciary for this program. The second is the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Grant. This is administered by the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Purpose of the HIDA program is to reduce drug trafficking and production of illegal drugs in the United States, specifically in areas where drug-related activities are having a harmful impact. This is high level. This is not street crimes. Requesting the committee recommend to council and that staff apply for an additional year of these two existing grants. The Bike Safe Motorcycle Program grant is $5,000, and the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program grant is $204,638, and there are no matching funds required by the city for either grant. Next. So the Bike Safe program is a partnership with the Governor's Highway Safety Program and the North Carolina State Highway Patrol. It's aimed at reducing motorcycle fatalities. Grant funds are used to promote awareness by contacting motorcycle dealers, clubs, and associations to discuss current highway safety activities and attend and or host training opportunities. The Asheville Police Department acts as the fiduciary for this program, and the total cost of the grant is $5,000 and does not require local matching funds. Next. The High Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Grant is a grant program administered by the Office of National Drug Control Policy. It was formed as a response to significant public health and safety threats facing the United States. Purpose of the program is to reduce drug trafficking and production of illegal drugs in the United States, specifically in areas where drug-related activities are having a harmful impact. This unit does not focus on or adopt cases that are for simple possession, but focuses only on cases dealing in trafficking, manufacturing, and distribution of the illegal drugs. Next. So key takeaways, the Bike Safe program is a partnership with the Governor's Highway Safety Program and the North Carolina State Highway Patrol, aimed at reducing motorcycle fatalities. Grant funds are used to promote awareness, and the police department acts as a fiduciary for the program. The High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program is a grant administered by the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Purpose of the program is to reduce drug trafficking and production of illegal drugs in the United States, specifically in areas where drug-related activities are having a harmful impact. We're requesting the committee recommend to council that staff apply for an additional year of funding for these two existing grants. The motorcycle program grant is $5,000, and the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program is $204,638. And no matching funds are required by the city for either grant. Next. So the requested action is that the committee recommend to council that staff apply for additional years of funding for these two grants, the Bike Safe Motorcycle Safety Program Grant, $5,000, and the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program Grant for $204,638.
Questions? from the
My
committee?
request is that we might consider both of these actions separately.
I believe that's the end of the slides. Next, is that the end?
Yeah, that's the end.
In that case, I would make a motion to recommend the Bike Safe Motorcycle Safety Grant Program by itself.
Would you like to call that motion?
I'll second that.
Okay. Roll call vote for approval. Councilwoman Kilgore,
Aye.
Councilwoman Roney,
Aye.
and myself, aye. And I would like to recommend to council to apply for the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Grant Program Grant. The dollar amount of $204,000. $204,000. I'm sorry, I'm all discombobulated today. $204,638. Is there a second?
I'll second.
With a
All right.
motion and a second, may I make a comment?
Sure.
I will not be supporting this because of the well-documented disparities in the war on drugs and because of our limited amount of resources, but our aspirational goals to reimagine public safety. My concern is that we use our limited resources, especially staffing, to address the root causes of crime in our community. So I will not be supporting this motion.
Sandra?
Well, only thing I was going to say is it seems a little, to me, ironic that you would be wanting to use this type of money here could actually be used to address some of the things that you and Shanika spoke of earlier that was so important to the community. So I question why you would not allow or even, allow council to apply for the city to apply for a grant that actually could help these programs that you so sorely think is invaluable to our community.
I'm happy to have a further discussion. My concern is that these kinds of programs result in the disproportionate extraction of resources from communities that have been historically divested from, which is how we ended up with the asset forfeiture funds in the first place. So this is the reason that we have the extraction happening.
No, I was talking about as far as this grant money, which is free money from the government. Why would you turn down that type of money that could help us?
So another way to say it is that we know the failures of the war on drugs, and yet we're still sending our staff not to address the root causes of the war on drugs and the crime and the violence in our youth, but instead reactive. And this is the kind of program funding that from every instance that I can see and research around not only our own community in Western North Carolina as a whole, but across our country, results in not addressing the root causes. I would love to send our staff to do programming and provide services addressing the root causes of crime. I worry that this it pulls those resources in another direction and actually doesn't help us in the long run.
Okay, but do you know what those restrictions and what that we can use for this money? I'm just saying. I mean, from what I'm looking at here, it looked like this type of grant could allow us more areas to deal with some of the things that you spoke of. So I'm just concerned about.
I really appreciate that. And I would imagine if we were applying for a grant to do something that our staff wasn't already doing, that we would not apply for the grant because we would say we didn't have enough staff to do it. So for me, this fits into that same lane of I don't think that we should be sending our staff to do this work, that we should be addressing the very serious issues with violence interrupter programming, with youth mentorship programming as the root causes and addressing the issues in our community that are experiencing violence today. But the history of applying for this grant is not resulting in the outcomes that
So,
to me reflect reimagining public safety.
so do you know of any programs that address those issues that the city can be applying for those grants available?
We did hear from JARC and youth mentorship programs at our last meeting. My hope is that we will hear back again how we are going to be pursuing funds for those kinds of programs.
So we can do both without doing either or. That's all I'm saying. We can do both.
Chief Zach, you had your hand raised.
It was actually Elise, but my point was already covered in their conversation, so I unraised it, so we're okay. Thank you.
I believe there's a motion. Deborah, did you want to speak?
No, I wanted to make sure that we clearly articulated what the grant can be used for. Elise or Chief Zach, if you all could repeat that.
Go back on the slide.
Can we go back a couple of slides to the, yes, that one. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, just
Okay,
go right on.
it's not on this one. This is the one.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me. I can't see that.
Oh, it's not, this printout was only for the forfeiture, that's fine. It's basically to reduce drug trafficking and production of illegal drugs. High level, this is the DEA.
And again, these are the high level cases. This isn't, goes directly to the manufacture and sale on a large scale. These are the large scale operations. This isn't small street trafficking that is addressed through this grant.
So would you say that no part of this grant is used during traffic stops?
No, I mean, there's always a possibility that a traffic stop could be involved in a high level investigation. So to say that it's never, but no, not in routine day-to-day police work. Again, this grant is used for the high level trafficking with high level targets.
So that's more or less preventive before it gets to the community. Is that sort of what we're looking at? So that, okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Kilgore. I was hoping that is what would be discussed, is that this is the preventive work before it hits the streets in our community. That's what I was trying to get across.
Perhaps at a future public safety committee meeting, we might look at the last 5 years or the last recent years of the HITA grant and what its outcomes have meant for our community, so we could have some sort of basis for continuing to fund it.
Absolutely.
This is not our grant.
So if it is not our grant, we certainly do use the funds, which is why we are being asked to allocate them. And so because we receive the grant and we use the funds, a better understanding for the community and for certainly for council on how the funds are used and what the outcomes are. Specifically, I'd be interested in where the high drug trafficking areas are, as we've seen maps in the past, along with presentations like this. What they're going to be used for and what the outcomes are would be helpful to informing the community.
I think we can get that information for you, Chief Zach.
Yeah, I believe last year we brought a representative in from the DEA who was able to articulate far better than we can. I mean, again, we're talking about cartel level trafficking and the impact and the areas that they work in throughout Western North Carolina.
We can bring that information back to you, Ms. Rooney. Thank other committee members.
There's a motion and a second. I'll do a roll call vote for approval. Sandra?
Aye.
Kim?
No.
Myself, aye. The motion carries. We'll move on to the next agenda item. Bridget Herron will provide an update on climate justice and neighborhood resiliency initiatives.
Good afternoon, members of council. Thanks for having me today. Again, my name is Bridget Herring, and I am the Sustainability Director for the city. So we can go on to the next slide. Perfect. The key takeaways that I want to leave you with today are first that climate justice recognizes that our frontline community members are resident experts in building and maintaining social safety networks that deploy resources in times of need. This leadership and lived experience will be centered in our emergency response planning. I believe my colleague is going to speak to that in the next presentation that you're going to hear. Secondly, we're working to take what we've learned to date in this initiative and apply that within city operations, which is one of the sustainability department's organizational work plan priorities for the year. And I'll have more on that later. And then lastly, that the collaborations and initiatives that stem from this work will increase neighborhood resilience, one of your strategic priorities. And I'll provide an example of how that has gone from a council adopted policy to implementation later in this presentation. So moving on to the next slide. You may remember this diagram. It was provided during the last council update that our office gave to you all on this initiative, but I wanted to share it again because for me, it helps me visualize the nexus of where climate justice and public safety overlap and come together. So you'll notice that resilience is in the center of this diagram as the goal of collaborating with emergency services and community partners. And so we recognize when we think about climate justice in terms of resilience and equity, again, we're recognizing that our frontline and BIPOC communities are often located in places that are most vulnerable to the impacts from climate change, that we feel the impacts of climate change even in blue skies times, as well as in times of major disruption. Again, that our frontline communities are the resident experts that are already deploying resources in times of need, and that this leadership and lived experience needs to be and will be centered in our emergency response planning. And that providing resources and information that support individual communities in identifying and implementing their own solutions, that's what builds capacity that contributes to neighborhoods and communities thriving during times of disruption. Right now, after the first two phases of this initiative, we're primarily in the top of the overlap piece, which is the access to information and kind of that foundational understanding of how equity and justice overlay into resilience. As we work towards implementing policies, procedures, and programs that we hope to move us all towards a more resilient future. Next slide. So this just further recaps the two presentations that we've provided to council to date on the work. So you've seen this information before, but that first bullet talks about those definitions that were really defined through the conversations that were had with our community to develop those definitions and define what climate justice, climate equity, and climate resilience means specifically to our Asheville community. We created the climate justice data map, which looks at vulnerabilities as it relates to climate, percent of resident BIPOC population, heat vulnerability, energy burden, and CDC social vulnerability. And this is a place where people can go in and put in their address or any address in the city and kind of see how those vulnerabilities are present in that area. We also developed a climate justice guidance screening tool, which is a resource for staff. It incorporates the equity choice points that our community kind of rose up to the top as opportunities for the city as an organization, as well as input from staff on practical practices for implementing this within our organization as a resource to utilize as we look at implementing projects going forward. And then we have a final report that kind of synthesizes the recommendations that came out of this project to date, and a story map that gives you an overview and kind of walks people through it in a different way in case all of the different links aren't something that people want to necessarily click and walk through. So all of these resources are available on our climate justice project page and available to the public. So next slide. So the things that were happening now and that I'm excited to share with you is that we're really trying to leverage what we heard and learned from the community and actively looking for opportunities to implement that in the way that we do work here at the city. The way we do this is, how we look at internal projects, and then primarily through our contracts and partnerships with external organizations that are carrying out council's priorities as well. And we're excited to see what this looks like as we take a fresh look at our emergency operations and response protocols in particular. So next slide. So this is a table. I'm not going to read everything in it, but it shows a snapshot of the actions taken and some future opportunities that were identified from some of the recommendations from the final report. So those items that are listed in red under the choice equity themes are areas where equity issues have been elevated and the organization has an opportunity to make a choice to adapt towards deeper climate equity work. And so then you can see in the column next to that, there's some examples of where actions have been taken that touch on those climate equity themes. And then in some future opportunities, just to keep us thinking how this might be implemented going forward and how you might see this come up in work that comes across a council agenda. So I'm not going to read all of these, but I do want to point out two things in particular. And one is the Faces of Change exhibit. Some of you may recall and were able to attend, but during our last phase of this work involved engaging with the youth, which concluded in about a dozen youth in our community expressing what they learned about climate resilience and climate change and vulnerabilities through art, primarily through photography. And it concluded in an art museum, an exhibit that hung at the Asheville Art Museum called Faces of Change, which I think was excellent. And now I'm excited to announce, and you probably have seen through our press release, that this exhibit is also going to be displayed in Pack Square sometime in the next few months as part of the Art in the Heart project. So excited to see that that work continues to be lifted up and shared with our community. And then the second piece I wanted to pull out was this low to moderate income weatherization, home repair, and solar installations. This work was ongoing previously, but I did want to highlight that because Council, you all decided to put more resources towards this with the American Rescue Plan Act funding. So another place in which we continue this work going forward. So if you go to the next slide, I think this slide is familiar to all of you, but I want to speak to how our department is working with the rest of the organization to apply these learnings. So this again captures how your vision gets funneled down into your annual strategic priorities and then eventually bubbles down into our work plan. And I believe that Climate Justice Initiative aligns really well with your strategic priorities to expand and improve core services as well as neighborhood resilience. So moving on to the next slide. For this fiscal year, the Sustainability Department has 2 organizational work plan priorities. This does not include all of the organization work plan priorities that we are a department on, or encompasses the items in our departmental work plan. But these are the 2 that have been identified as needing support and contributions from the organization as a whole, in which the Sustainability Department is the lead. So first, the Climate Justice Initiative, in which we have included the tools and resources that were developed with community input during the first 2 phases of the initiative. And it mainly goes when something goes from an idea into a prioritized project. So our department will be providing the resources that were developed as well as technical assistance to our colleagues to help work through what this looks like for the myriad of projects that the city takes on. The second is our Municipal Climate Action Plan, which will update our 2009 Sustainability Management Plan to incorporate the additional resolutions that you all as council have passed to date. Equity is one of the 3 prioritization factors that everything that will be recommended as actions to take will be measured against. And how that looks is both looking at what we've learned from the Climate Justice Initiative, as well as looking through our Equity Action Plan to see how those resonate with each other. So moving on to the next slide. And then so lastly, I just wanted to touch on the connection between climate justice and neighborhood resilience. So we know that neighborhood resilience is strengthened when information is shared so that the community can identify solutions. You know, this is not a situation in which the city is coming with all of this knowledge and saying, here are solutions and a menu for you to pick from, but more about how do we do some information sharing, like bidirectionally, right? So that we can learn how the community is supporting itself to better inform what we do, but also information that we have to share so the community can have a conversation, identify solutions, and then we can help identify resources that are driven in those particular communities. And then if we go to the next slide, that'll show an example again of how we've gone from policy into an implementation. And so some of you may be familiar with the Food Policy Action Plan. It was passed a number of years ago, but it's basically looking to try and increase access to locally grown, produced, nutritious food. And so over the years, how this is kind of manifested is by establishing a community garden and an edible parks program. So since the Climate Justice Initiative has been launched, we've kind of embedded this into our contract with Asheville Buncombe Food Policy Council and Bountiful Cities to start conversations as well around food access. So not just expanding where people can utilize public property to have access to this food, but also in community. What does the access look like? What does that security look like? And how is there a network that can be built to strengthen their resilience, especially in terms of food access in times of need? So the planning process started through that contract last year with the East End Valley neighborhood and the Deaverview neighborhood. And now in this next fiscal year that we're in now, we've provided more support through these contracts to take kind of the development and actually have some support for implementing them as well. So we hope that this is kind of a growing trend and that we're able to connect with more neighborhoods as trust and time goes on and is built. So I believe we go back to the next slide. Again, these key takeaways are listed here, but just want to leave you with that this initiative is an iterative process. Like we as city staff still have a lot to learn. The opportunity before us is to do better and more equitable engagement so that we as staff can be led and informed by existing community expertise and then marry that with the expertise we have on staff and our areas of influence to make sure that the public good and resources that we steward incorporate those lessons to create some more capacity in our community. And I believe that is my last slide. So if anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to answer those. Councilwoman Rooney.
Thank you so much for your work, Bridget. I know that y'all are one of the tiniest departments in City Hall, but you're doing some really mighty work. And I know that it takes a lot of work to build the relationships that lead to the trust that you talked about as we address these important issues. So my questions, when we're talking about neighborhood resiliency, one of the things that was listed as a potential action underneath that strategic priority was resilience hubs. Vice Mayor Smith brought that to the conversation. So I have it on my list to ask about, but also what does it look like to work with Parks and Rec during the facilities assessment so that we might identify what a resiliency hub would look like in a neighborhood?
So the interesting thing about resiliency hubs is that they can take a lot of different shapes. So some of them can manifest into a parks department and some of them can manifest in a privately owned parcel facility or something because it's all about where there is trust. We do have a list of the community centers that are also identified as FEMA shelters. And I think the opportunity is to identify where the community wants those to be, right? Because it's not us coming with solutions. There has to be something that comes up. Is working out what does that relationship look like, and what is that community center a safe space that people want to come to? What do they want to come to it for? And then we look at how would we identify those solutions within that facility. So it's probably going to be more about partnership. But again, we don't want to come assuming that that's a solution that people are looking for. And so we need to make sure that we have those conversations and identify the solutions so that we can identify the resource.
So when we see facilities assessments come through, is it possible that we might see recommendations for those kinds of locations?
I would say with the timeline that the comprehensive facility study is on, that is unlikely because we haven't heard specific recommendations in that space. I think that there's an interest in building resilience and capacity in our operations that touches on a number of our other sustainability goals, and that might be a way that we see it come through the study, but I don't think that the timelines would necessarily totally jive for that.
Okay. And then is there any outreach being done with the neighborhood advisory committee or neighborhood associations to address we know we had a scoring rubric for neighborhoods that were most vulnerable to climate change impacts?
So the climate justice map was kind of the first step of the first initiative, and that's how we identified the places of which we had what we refer to as the story circles, where we started to have the conversations. And so, as I said, that only happened with a few specific neighborhoods at the time. And really making sure that those conversations were held with our BIPOC community leaders and members. And so those happened in Shiloh and Emma. And then we tried to orchestrate one in public housing that turned into just kind of like a non-geographic specific story circle. I mean, I think COVID obviously had a big impact on people's capacity to participate in something like that, right? So we also have to be mindful as we do this outreach that it's something that is a two-way conversation that the community wants to have. So I think we hope to expand that to other neighborhoods as well, but we focused on the places that were vulnerable and had a lot of BIPOC community members. So we have not engaged with the neighborhood advisory committee to date.
As a liaison to Neighborhood Advisory Committee, I'm curious if they might be interested in hearing a presentation since neighborhoods are part of this. And my last question is around, I heard about the East End Valley Street and Deaver View actions. Might we anticipate a budget recommendation for a future budget around deepening food security, not just responding during emergency times? Because I know that's part of the Asheville Buncombe Food Policy Council's work, is getting to the root causes of why there is food insecurity.
Right. And I think, that's what we've been doing to date, right? In terms of looking at where we have space for community gardens and working at having more edibles on public property and increasing that access and providing information on where those resources are so people can find them. So I don't know that there'll be a specific budget recommendation, but I will say that we've continued to try and expand that work since that policy was adopted in 2013. So
thank you, Bridget.
Any more questions? Thank you, Bridget. We'll move on to our last item, and that is the city's emergency management plan. Deputy Fire Chief Bazinski, you're going to present that.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Vice Mayor and Council. I'm Chris Bazinski. I'm the Deputy Fire Chief, and today we're going to give you an update on where we're at with our emergency management plan. Next slide, please. So the emergency management plan is actually two separate plans. It's the emergency operations plan and the continuity of operations plan. Our key takeaways are we're going to discuss what this means for the city of Asheville and what our projects, high level of project charter and scope of work, and also to know that they are complete and hopefully will be going out soon for vendor solicitation. We're also going to highlight that the EOP in the COOP reflects the current organization of the city, the operational nature of our city during all hazard incidents, engagement of stakeholders, and the community in the planning process, which is critical to the success of both plans. We're also we'll be doing a tremendous amount of coordination with other planning efforts and plans. As you heard from Ms. Herring, all of the plans such as climate resiliency, food action plan are rolled into a piece of this plan so that they're a part of the action during a incident, both in the preparedness, response, and recovery side of that response. Next slide, please. Here we are. So the focus of the emergency operations plan, that is really the response piece. An incident occurs and we begin to execute the action plans related to whatever that emergency incident is. So whether that's a flooding event, whether that's a pandemic, there's specific action items related to each of those types of incidents. So that is really the external focus of the emergency management plan. That's the work that has to be done once an incident occurs. The continuity of operations plan is the make sure that we can, as a city, execute the essential functions that have to occur when these emergency situations arise. So that if you can think of the continuity of operations plan as the internal piece, making sure that the city is can sustain operations and at what level we can sustain basic operations, essential operations, and other operations on top of that. Both of these plans do engage the whole community by using a planning process. That's a big part of the RFP that's in the scope of work, is making sure that the vendor, along with us, we're guiding the conversations that we're having within the community. Because as Ms. Herron mentioned, we know that places that have high risk for, or could have high risk for, say, a flood, may impact specific communities disparately. So we want to make sure that we're hearing their voices and that we're able to incorporate their feedback into the planning process. Because additionally, as Ms. Herron said, they have a tremendous amount of expertise and they have the lived experience of going through these events in the past that we can harness to make our plan more effective and more realistic for the response. In addition to the community, we'll also be involved in the entire city of Asheville, all departments within the city of Asheville. They'll also touch with employees and also the private sector of our community. This plan is being coordinated and facilitated by the fire department, but it is not just a city of Asheville plan, but a community-wide plan. That's critical. Having this input is critical to the success of these plans. Next slide, please. So some highlights of what is in our the scope of work for these plans. On the emergency operations side, we talked about utilizing all of the functional departments within the city. This plan impacts every single department. So all the departments within the city will provide input and help guide the development of the plan. We're modernizing our emergency operations plan. Our current plan that we are operating under was from the early 2000s. So it is pretty out of date. So this plan will help to modernize that. In addition to modernizing it now, part of the plan is to make sure that it has continuous updates. So not just for the emergency operation plan, but any other plans that are folded into or that we touch, because it's so foundational, those will also have requirements to be reviewed and updated if necessary so that they remain relevant as well. We're also building the plan out. The goal is so that as more plans are developed, whether it's departmentally or for the community, that those can be included in the emergency operations plan so that it remains relevant, as I mentioned earlier. And then engaging those stakeholders in the community, that is so critical to the success of the plan. And that is part of the scope of work. And it's a big piece of how the RFP will be scored as well. So moving on to the continuity of operations plan, like I said, this is the more internal piece of the emergency response plans, but it involves leadership and other members of the organization from all of our city departments, so that they have input into the plan and it's relevant to their departments. Make sure that it's flexible enough and scalable so that depending on the size of the emergency, depends on how the plan is executed and also how broad the execution of that plan has to be, whether that's a wide scale emergency or a department specific issue. And then also making sure that we're planning to take care of our employees, who are the most critical resource to any execution of a plan during an issue. Next slide, please. So an example of how the emergency operations plan is it's the foundation for all of our plans as it relates to emergency response. I think I had a network outage.
I think we all had an outage.
Yeah, I think a few had the outage as well. I think we're probably back up. Jenna, I defer to you.
Yeah. So, so one example is the food policy action plan. So this tells us that our plan will have trigger points so that we know when we need to proactively activate during a response. It will provide where we can get access to food and distribution. How do we involve outside emergency response stakeholders? So that could be state emergency management, for example. How other City of Asheville departments can support that response. Who are assisting and coordinating community agencies, such as our nonprofits and the private sector, and how can they assist us in this response? And then managing updates, not only communication to the public, because there is a communication piece of these plans, so that we're predictable communication to the community, but also, as I mentioned earlier, making sure that we're updating these policies so that they stay relevant and we have the right people, the right organizations plugged into the policy so that we're making the most efficient use of the policy. So next slide, please. So here's our schedule and next steps. So as I mentioned earlier, the scope of work and the RFP is pretty much done. It's gone through all of the city internal processes and it is ready to post. So we hope to have that posted within the next week. We'll begin to receive responses in September and October, and that's when we'll begin to evaluate those proposals and award the contract. We expect the on-site work to begin in January or February, and that's when the stakeholder communication, community communication, planning process will begin. And then we hope to, by June 23rd, have a rough draft of deliverables from the contractor to the City of Asheville. Our plan is to consistently, when we hit milestones in the process, is to update this committee and at any other time that you'd like to make sure that you're up to date on where we're at in the schedule and process. Next slide, please. So our key takeaways again are we went over what the Emergency Operations Plan and Continuity Operations Plan means to the city and the project charter and scope. The EOP and COOP will reflect the current organization of the city, the operational nature of our city during all hazard incidents, engagement of stakeholders in the community in the planning process, and we'll be coordinating because these plans are foundational elements that anchor our preparedness, response, and recovery. Both plans are essential to building resilience and will directly coordinate with all current and future plans. So with that, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
This is Kim. Thank you for the presentation. My curiosity is around what kind of outreach is being done with neighborhood organizations as stakeholders so that if there is a crisis in a neighborhood, that you have up-to-date information on contact points, for example.
So I think the beauty of this type of plan is it's foundational. So we're able to harness the expertise of all of the city organization. So with our neighborhood coordinator and through CAPE, that's how we plan on making sure that we're in the right venues and using the right message and tactics to reach any community that's in need. As part of the scope of work, we'll be working closely with them to help them develop a communications plan so that with all those organizations I just mentioned, or departments, and also others that we can identify to help us reach our community.
I know we have a new neighborhood coordinator in the position has been recently filled. So I look forward to hearing more updates on that.
Thank you for your presentation today. We'll move on to public comment. I believe we have 2 callers.
Caller ending in 2266, your line is open.
Hi, Grant Millen, longtime Asheville resident. Thank you for allowing me to participate. If I'm not mistaken, the City of Asheville Climate Justice Initiative excludes citizens with disabilities. I can't imagine what law or form of ethics, sense of justice and trust, or equity concept within the U.S. government, of which City of Asheville is part of, would exclude the issues of disability, citizens with disabilities, identity, and emergency management issues, let alone the existential threat of a failing climate and the outcome of the anthropogenic climate to climate protection transition. Citizens with disabilities are all genders, races, sexual orientations, and creeds. APD officers are needed to follow up on surveillance images, Vice Mayor. So the staff level there, that's correct. When the city manager brings that up, cutting that budget for seats that aren't in patrol vehicles or on bikes or on foot patrols, you need to leave the budget for the recruiting to work. As part of hopefully finally beginning the Asheville Public Safety Strategy, I asked that PSC members and the city manager look at President Biden's Safer America plan. The ACLU has criticism about our mission to pursue a more perfect union, but it is our mission to pursue a more perfect union. We might not always get a perfect union immediately. I have equity questions about the U.S. justice system, and it's unfortunately an imperfect system, but the narcotics, the illegally manufactured synthetic narcotics flowing through Asheville right now, people get guns to protect their loads and their cash. I think you'll find it didn't really work to say it's not about gangs, it's not about drugs, it's about guns, it's about all those things. And asset seizures seems to be a way of addressing the massive amounts of money made in these deadly forms of profiteering. And I'm working on getting the death toll numbers. It's not like the homicide numbers. It's going to be, we need to talk about it honestly. But I hope that has been helpful, the Asheville Public Safety Strategy. Don't go over the HITA and the other federal programming every year. Just give a definition of what HITA is. And
Caller, you're at 3 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Caller ending in 7629, your line is open.
Hi, Public Safety Committee. It's Grace Martinez. I wish I was going to be able to see you tonight at the council meeting, but unfortunately, I am dealing with a family health emergency, and so I'm being systematically excluded from participation in my community, which is exactly why remote comment should be allowed at all meetings. I really appreciate Patrick Conan's comments as usual at the beginning, and I appreciated sentiments from all 3 council members at today's meeting. Let's remember that the war on drugs is and has always been a war on drug users. I love the talk of prevention, Shanika, and I think we know that policing is never proactive. It is always punitive, and it does not address our root causes. I know we all share a concern for community violence, and police have, for me, actually set an example of violence in our community. I have unfortunately witnessed several shootings, but only police have actually shot projectiles directly at me and many, many others in our community. Sandra, I love the conversation about finding additional funding in the budget where we have it from the lack of staffing, and take that savings and put it into community resources. I really appreciate it. And that's exactly what so many of us have been asking for. I'd love to explore that further. And yet here we are with more and more money for police, be it between these asset forfeiture funds or the high intensity drug trafficking grant. But since this is free money from the government, let's try removing the rest of those funds on the other side, which you all can control from the police budget. Take those exact dollar amounts and remove them on the police side, and then you can decide how we want to spend it. And you can make a motion to do so and do things like your violence interruption program, which is like something that's wholly separate from APD, which I fully agree with. Also, I don't understand why Deborah's talking about how we're using police to deal with homelessness. That's the whole problem. It's completely inappropriate. I also wanted to briefly discuss the trial of Greenleaf Clark, which you can read about in the Asheville Blade. It's really a foreshadowing of what APD has done with the remainder of the Aston Park defendants who were charged in December's action. There was body cam footage presented at the trial that was completely exonerating, and the assistant district attorney was probably embarrassed to have wasted the judge's time presenting it in court by trusting APD on the charges. I also found it extremely disturbing during the trial that Captain Moore, who is a crisis intervention team trainer, there was body cam footage that showed that clearly, if he's the trainer for this, it's very disturbing because the way that they reacted to the mental health crisis that was going on in the body cam footage is completely inappropriate. And I have been trained in de-escalation, and they actually escalated the situation further,
You're
put
at
someone
3
in
minutes.
Thanks.
That's the end of our public safety meeting on today. I appreciate all the staff members who are here to share information and present what's now and in our future. Thank you to all the councilwomen for your conversation and your insights. That is the end of our meeting today. I look forward to our next meeting where we'll continue to do this good work. I'll see you all later.